During the last 4 lectures, we looked at Great Britain in a lot of detail. We looked at its political and administrative system. We found that it was perhaps the only country with an unwritten constitution, evolved from convention and statutes from time to time. And we found the system working perfectly even under a so-called unwritten constitutional setup. The lower house in case of UK as compared to US was found to be the more powerful house in this bicameral setup. We found that the British Prime Minister was not as powerful as the US President. He exercises much less powers as compared to his counterpart in America. We also found how the bureaucracy, the administrative system had moved over a period of time from a patronage system, a pure patronage system, to an open competitive system which is being followed these days. And in that evolution, there was a large contribution, momentous contribution of many commissions and committees who came up with very interesting and productive reports, which were implemented also. And we also found out that the concept of a civil servant and administrative officer coming from a liberal arts background primarily, or any background for that matter, but having attained a certain level of intellectual attainment, were the kind of people who got into the civil service through the competitive exam. And they were generalists. But these so-called generalists got extensive pre-entry and post-entry trainings. They were well paid. They had a pension to look forward to. And they had a full career path in front of them. So the British system did manage to attract good talent, still does so. We also looked at the local government being a unitary state. The UK control the the central government in UK controls whatever powers are to be delegated or given to the local councils. And we found that mostly to a 3-tier system except in the semi-urban areas, existed in the UK. The county and the councils, and then we have for London this special system of boroughs also, and the parishes in the rural areas elected representatives of the people, running their own affairs at the grassroots level. Immense powers. Lot of powers and autonomy was available to the local government in the UK. So having looked at these two distinct forms of government, the presidential form and the parliamentary form, to separate in distinct models on which democratic states are based. As we went along, we tried to compare and contrast some aspects, and also brought in the ingredient of our own civil service and our own parliamentary system in our discussions. After having looked at these two systems, we will be looking at two more systems. That is how the democracies, parliamentary democracies, you could call them, how the parliamentary democracy in Japan works and how the presidential system in France works. They are slightly differently designed than what we have seen in the case of the presidential system in the US and the parliamentary system in the UK. The differences in also the nature of the organization of the civil service and the subdivision and organization of various services. Although the role of this agency, whichever is controlling the civil service, remains more or less the same, but there is a fair amount of structural difference apart from the rank and position aspects in the working of these bureaucracies. So today we'll start off with Japan. First of all, the constitution as usual. We have this Meiji period of a very long period of monarchy in Japan, which is called the Meiji Restoration period. During this, there was a Meiji constitution, and it was based on the concepts of autocracy, authoritarianism, and monarchy. The Meiji kings were up there, and all powerful. The civil servants or the administrators would work at their pleasure and do their bidding. Whatever they were told to do, they would do so. And then, of course, we have the period of the Second World War, during which Japan suffered a lot. And then the American occupation forces were there for about 7 years, from 1945 to 1952. This is a great turning point in the history, also the constitutional and administrative history of Japan. It has left an indelible mark on the psyche of the Japanese people also, after those unfortunate nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We all know about the immense amount of damage that did to life and property, and the destruction and the havoc which occurred has no parallel in history. So, what happens? How does a nation reconstruct after that? As far as the modern constitution of Japan is concerned, the US has a lot of role to play in that. The US actually wanted that Japan should never rise again as a military power. And we'll see that the Constitution of Japan, which is also called the MacArthur Constitution, because it was General MacArthur who was in charge of the forces in Japan, of the occupation forces in Japan. And he tried to mold the Constitution in a manner which was in the interest of the United States, and from their point of view, in the interest of the whole world. So this period of Allied occupation is when the Constitution of Japan came into existence. Japan adopted a new democratic constitution in 1947, so that autocratic constitution was gone and a democratic constitution was ushered in under the US umbrella. So many of the thought processes which went into the framing of this constitution were de facto emanating from the US. Of course, through the head of the occupation forces, General MacArthur. So the new constitution we are talking about now is based on the ideals of democracy and peace. That is what the Americans wanted. They have always been so-called champions of democracy. So here is a chance to tell the world that you are converting an autocratic, a monarchic country into a democratic one. So why not avail that chance? And peace. This is very interesting. We'll see how it is written in the Constitution that Japan will not go to war. They do have self-defense arrangements and also an administrative authority for that. An administrative organization for that. But the Constitution, framed under the influence of the Americans, says Japan shall not go to war. So that's why they're saying it is based on the ideals of democracy and peace. And as we have seen that this constitution became operative in 1947. It is a written constitution. We saw that the United States has a fairly ambitious written constitution. Which bestows a lot of freedom on the people. In the case of UK, we found how certain contracts, social contracts in the form of charters, had evolved and become, over history, a part of the unwritten constitution. Here we have in Japan a written constitution under the influence of a superpower. So, like the American Constitution, it borrows mostly from American concepts, although it is generally called a blend of American and British constitutional concepts. But most concepts, it's not a presidential form, but most concepts, it couldn't be because of that long history of monarchy, like the king and queen in Britain. So it is a written constitution, and it's a fairly ambitious written constitution. It has 103 articles. There are 11 chapters of the Constitution with 103 articles, and it deals with about 12 major topics, including the monarchy and its powers, the Diet, which is the name given to both the houses, there being a bicameralism in Japan also. Both the houses are known as Diet. Like in the US, both the houses are known as Congress. It also spells out the nature and functions and scope of the local governments in great detail. It is a rigid constitution. What is a rigid constitution? A constitution which is not easy to amend, as we saw. We can't have that problem with the British Constitution, because it's evolving, it has evolved, it's unwritten. And some statutes become part of it. But since the United States was the main source of inspiration in this case, the Japanese Constitution is not a flexible one. It cannot be amended by the Diet easily. There is a special process in which a large majority of both the houses of the parliament, which is the Diet, the lower and the upper house, have to agree on any amendment. And following that, very interesting, not available in most other constitutions, the amendment shall be referred to the people at large. So, you go in for a referendum. Everyone will have a vote in that referendum. Each and every voter of Japan will vote in that referendum. Now, there has to be really some reason for such an amendment then, where you are wanting the will of the people to be reflected on a collective basis in the amendment directly. Of course, once the amendment is there, it will go to the monarch for formal assent. But once assented to, you are actually assenting to the will of the people, to all the populace. So this additional mechanism of referendum for amending the Constitution is a very interesting aspect of the Japanese constitutional framework. And now, what are the features of this Constitution? It is a unitary Constitution. As we saw, in the UK we have a unitary Constitution. In the US we don't have a unitary Constitution. It is a federation. In Pakistan we don't have a unitary setup because it is a federation again. So like the UK, the Constitution envisaged here was unitary. Generally, unitary constitutions, or the unitary approach to constitution reflects that there are a lot of commonalities in the people. They are not very heterogeneous. And in such cases, it would be worthwhile to have one single central government and then the local governments. However, we are seeing now in the UK that Scotland, which always had its identity and was known as Caledonia once, is reasserting to get out of the system and be independent. The ethnicity aspect is very important when you are considering the form of a constitution. In case of Japan, almost everyone living in Japan belongs to the same stock. And the ethnic diversity is non-existent. So, why not have a unitary state? All powers are vested in the single supreme central government located at Tokyo. So Tokyo is the Mecca. All the power is there. Or it's the center of attraction. And then the central government delegates its power to the provinces. As was done in case of UK. Powers were given to the counties. In this case, they are given to the provinces. Now the provinces do not enjoy any powers on their own, per se, no inherent powers. And the parliament or the diet can increase or decrease their powers depending upon the ground realities or political will or some new developments. So the powers are not fixed in the Constitution. The nature of the powers are not laid down. The Parliament will keep on adjusting that delegation of power at its will. Now let us look at the form of government and the relationship between the monarchy and the elected executive. Some important features of the Japanese parliamentary system are as under: the emperor is the nominal executive, while the cabinet is the real executive. So the cabinet of ministers is the real executive in the country, not the king or queen. The emperor is, of course, the ceremonial head and head of the state, but no real executive powers. But maybe more powers than what we see with the King or Queen of England. Perhaps the strength of the monarchy had not diluted very much, historically speaking, till the Second World War. Whereas we see that historic evolution of the dilution of the powers of the monarch, in the case of UK, spread over centuries actually. So, the cabinet is the real executive organ. So this is what happens in a parliamentary democracies always. The party which secures majority seats in the House of Representatives forms the government, and the leader of the majority party becomes the Prime Minister. This invariably happens in all parliamentary systems. Whoever gets a simple majority has the right to become the Prime Minister of the country. It happens in our system too, very much so. Although at times to muster the necessary votes to become the party in power, to become the Prime Minister, it may be necessary to take some smaller parties along to get that magic figure which will give you the simple majority to become a Prime Minister. And hence, the House, it would be considered that the Parliament has reposed confidence in you. Now the PM has to be from the Parliament. He has to be one of the members of the Parliament. Always the case in parliamentary democracies. We have had in our own setup some examples of people who were of a non-political background becoming prime ministers through some manipulations. At times, they may be brought in to contest from a seat of the party from some constituency from which a member of the party in power had already won. So he is asked for resignation, and the person who is to be accommodated gets elected from that seat. Eventually he has to become a prime minister. He was designated as a prime minister in someone's mind. So he is made a prime minister. Interesting things happening in our country. Now the cabinet ministers are called the ministers of state in Japan. The prime minister can remove the ministers of state. So the prime minister appoints the ministers of states, and he has the power to also remove the ministers of state. Generally it is so in parliamentary democracies. In Pakistan it is the same. Sometimes we talk about this reshuffle in our cabinet. In the Pakistani cabinet. What is that? That some ministers are being removed or their portfolios are being changed. New ministers are coming in. And this is an exercise which is carried out by the Prime Minister. Of course, the formal notification is by the Cabinet Secretariat, the Cabinet Division. But it is the Prime Minister's decision which is being implemented whenever there is a reshuffle in the cabinet or new ministers are being sworn in. In case of Japan, the emperor can dissolve the House of Representatives on the advice of PM. Again, ceremonial or formality, you can say. Rather a formality for the emperor to sign that letter of dissolution, has to sign that letter or notification dissolving the assembly. Apparently he can't say no to the PM if the PM advises him to dissolve the assembly. Some differences between what happens in UK and what happens in Japan. In UK, Prime Minister is chosen as well as appointed by the King or Queen. Again, this is a technicality actually. The majority, the person in whom the majority of the legislators have reposed their confidence will have to be appointed the Prime Minister. But formally, we see that the Constitution requires choosing of the Prime Minister by the Parliament in the UK. And we know it's a big affair in the UK when the Prime Minister is being chosen by the King or Queen and being appointed after that. So the choice and appointment, which is always in keeping with the spirit of democracy, of parliamentary democracy, is made by the King or the Queen in England. On the other hand, slight difference in Japan, the Parliament or the Diet is going to choose the Prime Minister directly, and then the monarch or the King or the Queen will appoint that Prime Minister formally. Again, in the UK, Ministers also are appointed by the king or queen. Again, a formal thing. In Japan, the Prime Minister is powerful in this regard. He is going to appoint the ministers directly, does not even have to send a piece of paper to be signed by the king or queen in that regard. So full powers in Japan with the Prime Minister to appoint ministers and also to remove them. In the UK, again, the same process has to be followed if you have to remove a minister. So we see that the Prime Minister, in case of Japan, is somewhat more powerful than is somewhat more powerful than the counterpart in UK, but not as powerful as the chief executive, that is the president in the US. In UK, all ministers have to be members of parliament. In Japan, only a majority has to be members of the Diet. This is very interesting, very different. What we are actually saying is that a non-elected person can become a minister in Japan. This doesn't happen generally in democracies. In fact, some very senior bureaucrats are also appointed as vice ministers. And they become part of the administrative, and they become part, rather they're heading the administrative ministry at a point in time. Although their powers may be almost the same as the federal secretary in Pakistan, but they are called vice ministers. And they may be assisting the minister of state, holding that portfolio, in running the affairs. So only a majority of ministers need be from the Diet or the Parliament. Now the monarchy. What are the characteristics of the monarchy in Japan? We have some provisions in the constitution. The emperor is the symbol of the state and the unity of the people. In Japan, the emperor is always looked up to. And the very word emperor, as compared to a king or queen, the word emperor conjures up and in our imagination a very powerful person. So the emperor is the symbol of the state and the unity of the people. So he is, in a way, head of the state. He is the head of the state. And loyalty, or looking up to one person with reverence and with hopes and good feelings. If you look up to someone, that person may well be a symbol of unity for the people. The imperial throne is dynastic and succeeded to in accordance with the law passed by the Diet. So this is interesting. Generally, monarchies are dynastic, but there can be infighting, there can be different ways of adjusting dynasties. In fact, in the Middle East, we see a different system of succession to the throne, whereas here in Japan, it has to be in accordance with the law. And the law for succession to the imperial throne is being made by the parliament. Not really a question of check or balances here, but an interesting aspect that you are letting the Diet formalize what is happening in the shape of a statute. Now, the check and balance part of it, the advice and approval of the cabinet is required for all acts of the emperor. So, emperor is not going to wake up one day and say, okay, here is a major policy decision. This has to happen. There's a complete system. And there's a lot of bureaucracy around the emperor also. The senior officers from the administrative services who are serving with the emperor, very high-ranking officers. So this system of advice and approval goes on. The emperor performs only those acts which are enumerated in the constitution. So, in olden times, the emperors used to assume every power, assume new powers. Not so anymore. The constitution lays down the powers of the emperor and his functions. Can't go beyond that. And finally, this is interesting. So imperial property in a way is not the personal property of any monarch, of any emperor. So he can't give it away to anyone else. If there is a big imperial estate, it cannot be just given off to someone based on the whims of the emperor. So as far as the royal property is concerned, or the imperial property is concerned, that is institutionalized and goes with the institution. And he can't also receive property in that category. The constitution is supreme. How? The Japanese constitution establishes the principle of supremacy of constitution because the Japanese Supreme Court derives its power of judicial review directly from the constitution. Which is not the case as far as the process of judicial review in the US is concerned. We found that this was one very important check and balance. The ability of a court to strike down a law, declare it ultra vires, saying that is not in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution. So in this Constitution overseen by General MacArthur, we see how this concept of judicial review got integrated. In the United States, over a period of time, the judges, some very strong judges, had assumed the power of judicial review from small beginnings to a very well established power. It was not described as such or laid down as such in the American Constitution. But here we see, having seen that this system of check and balances was working so well in the US and had contributed towards the rights of the people, it was made an integral part of the Constitution. The Constitution specifically lays down that the Supreme Court is the last resort with power to determine the constitutionality of any law, order, regulation, or official act. So, very clear over here. This is much more than judicial review, perhaps. Supreme Court becomes the last platform. If you have gone through all other phases to get and have not been granted relief, you will go to the Supreme Court and say, well, this law, this order, this regulation affecting me is unconstitutional. And if it is, it will be struck down by the court. Now the fundamental rights, the question of fundamental rights, has always been close to the heart of the American people. They have that Statue of Liberty there. On an island close to Manhattan. So, they wanted to elucidate and incorporate clearly as many rights as were possible for the people of Japan in the Constitution. The Japanese Constitution provides for rights on the model of the Bill of Rights of the USA. Out of 103 articles in the Constitution, 31 are devoted to the rights and duties of the people. Duties also. They go together. Now this is almost 1/3 of the Constitution, maybe a little less. So almost 1/3 of the Constitution is devoted to the fundamental rights of the people. And what are the major ones? The right to equality. Everyone is equal, at least theoretically. The right to freedom, unless you have to be restrained under due process of law. Right to freedom of religion, very important in our times. They may be overwhelmingly Buddhists or whatever, but everyone has the right to practice their religion, as enshrined in the Constitution. Then the right to private property. You can own property and no one can take away that property from you. Theoretically, no Kabza groups. Right to education, very important. In our Constitution, we have also instituted many such rights, but we see how they are trampled, how they are abused day in and day out. The right to education. Everyone has the right to get an education. Economic rights of people, cultural rights of people. The Japanese are very proud of their culture. From their kimonos to their tea ceremonies, they are very, very proud of their culture. And they have a very interesting culture. So cultural rights. And then, now we talk about that very interesting aspect of the Constitution, which is the renunciation of war. The Japanese Constitution renounces war as a sovereign right of the nation. Japan cannot go to war. Its sovereignty is limited in that sense, that it cannot wage war, declare war against any nation. Maybe at the back of the mind of the people, this would be a very acceptable thing because of the sufferings they went through during the time of during the Second World War. The only victims of nuclear warfare in the world. So it prohibits Japan from maintaining land, sea, and air forces as well as other war potential. If you don't have to go to war, you don't need these things, so don't have these things. So you won't have the means of going to war, you will automatically not go to war. So the US made sure by inserting this also in the Constitution, a very comprehensive renunciation of war, that you can't have your military forces or military equipment. It does not also recognize the right of belligerency of the state. You can't be belligerent, you can't show off power. You can't try to overawe, create awe in the minds of other nations through your power. Belligerency. Although the United States itself is a very, very belligerent nation, but here they wanted this to be incorporated in the Constitution. So Japan is the only modern state which has constitutionally renounced war forever. And all this part of the Constitution devoted to renunciation of war got inserted by General MacArthur. And we can understand why. So as we already saw that there are two houses, it's a bicameral setup in Japan, and the two houses together are called the Diet. It consists of the House of Councillors and the House of Representatives. And of course, together, Diet is the highest organ of state power, The House of Councillors consists of 252 members elected for a 6-year term, a long term. Continuity, ensures continuity. Well, in case you got the right policies in place, that is a very good thing. And very interesting, 100 of these members are elected on a constituency basis, whereas 152, that is the remaining, are elected on a nationwide basis. So balancing both the regions within Japan and the overall national representation. The House of Representatives consists of 512 members, elected for a term of 4 years. Shorter term, there are a lot of members. 512 members. Japan is not a very big country when it comes to actual area. Geographically, it's a few islands. Now the House of Representatives, which is the lower house in a way, has more powers as compared to the House of Councillors, especially in financial matters. So the more powerful house out of the two houses is the House of Representatives. Unlike in the United States, you got the Senate, which is more powerful. The upper house, which again on a regional basis balances out the representation. Now a little bit about the organization of the central government. This is in fact almost generic to all countries. The most important, almost the same subjects for which services are available or ministries are created. The organization of central government in Japan, as determined by the National Government Organization Law, is as under. So, following the promulgation of the Constitution, there was this law under the Constitution, National Government Organization Law, which created these ministries. Not just the ministries, but the PM office and 12 ministers heading the following ministries. Which ministries are those? Ministry of Finance. This is supposed to be the most important ministry in Japan. The bureaucrats working in finance ministry of Japan are really looked up at. They are real elite. And they're very pampered, even by the private sector. Then the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Health, you know, the usual subjects. The Ministry of International Trade, very important. We do know how rapidly Japan grew and developed following the Second World War, especially once the occupation forces left. Immense curve going up like this, unprecedented growth rates, the kind which China is enjoying these days. And ultimately it did become the second biggest economy of the world. Japan became. Japanese goods were and still are held in great esteem all over the world. And the Ministry of International Trade is supposed to have played a great role in that. Of course, backed by the Ministry of Industries, which used to provide direction to the economy. Okay, now we are going to, this decade, we're going to make cars and cars and cars and become the leader of the car industry in the world. This was one of the policies given by the Ministry of Industry to the economy when all these Toyotas and Hondas came up and monopolized the car market of the world and pushed the US out, and European cars out of markets. Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, always very important, especially in case of Japan, which had to play a very balancing role, do a balancing act vis-a-vis its foreign affairs. It cannot go to war. So you have a ministry of a very different type vis-a-vis the thinking in it and the approach as compared to foreign ministries of other countries. Ministry of Education, the literacy rate is extremely high. Ministry of Construction, rapid growth required this. Ministry of Telecommunication, Ministry of Agriculture. And in addition then, there are commissions and agencies of the government. And it's interesting that these commissions and agencies are organized around the PM's office, the Prime Minister's office. In fact, they can be considered as external organs of the Prime Minister's office. And this gives them a lot of power, a lot of importance. If you can get your decisions from the Prime Minister quickly because you have access to him, being part of his office in a way, then things move. So which ones are those? The National Public Safety Commission, the Fair Trade Commission, the Environmental Disputes Coordination Commission. Japan always had a lot of emphasis on environment. Very good environmental policies. Although the recent disaster at nuclear power plants shook them, they still controlled it well. Management and Coordination Agency, very important, with the Prime Minister. And this has played a lead role in the development of the country. The Economic Planning Agency, which is always that very important core. Planning, if planning is good, you are almost there. Of course, we can't apply this to Pakistan. We plan very well, but we are not good implementers. But countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, they are both good policymakers and implementers. Then again, Environment Agency, this time a regular Environment Agency. The other one was related to disputes which might arise out of environmental issues. National Land Agency, Science and Technology Agency, very important. Some of the universities of Japan rank very high amongst the world. Science and Technology Agency, Defense Agency. Now, you are calling it Defense Agency. So if someone comes and tries to run you over or something. You at least have to defend yourself. The Imperial Household Agency, a full-fledged agency to look after imperial affairs, after the emperor's establishment and his officers. Okinawa Development Agency, Hokkaido Development Agency. So, two very important areas which they wanted developed very quickly. Now it's very interesting. Ministries are headed by cabinet ministers, and these ministers also are called the ministers of state. And in addition to that, depending upon the nature of the ministry, there may be vice ministers. There may be one or two vice ministers along with the cabinet minister who will look after the affairs of this ministry. And as I stated before, that the administrative vice minister would be a career civil servant also. So a senior, well-experienced civil servant is becoming a vice minister here. So giving this unprecedented or otherwise not available in other countries, this respect and high level of position, this very high position to the senior most civil servants makes a lot of difference. It provides a great boost and morale boosting for the civil service. And also it dilutes that administrative political dichotomy which is so characteristic of bureaucracies. So a very interesting and important aspect. So this is all for this lesson today. Next time we'll continue with Japan and talk about its administrative system in detail and the local government system which Japan enjoys. Thank you.